Hey guys, I'm AH Designs and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be showing you the process that I went through, the 2.5-month progress I went through on making this petticoat right here in all its ruffly glory. So you'll notice in this video that there's not actually as much footage as you might expect, considering how much yardage, how many hems, and how many layers there are here. But that is because a lot of this process was very tedious and repetitive because again, you got a lot of ruffling, a lot of hemming, etc. So a lot of things were done over and over and over again. So I'm not going to show you every single ounce of footage because that would have been just a little bit too much. Towards the end of this video, I am going to give you the rundown on like how much yardage is actually in here, how many meters of hem I had to do, how many ruffles are on here, and things like that, as well as show you the final piece on. And before I actually start talking a little bit about the process, I'm going to just give you a heads up. So this was again filmed over a 2-month progress, and then it took me about a month to get to this point here where I'm filming again just due to other things going on in life. So you're gonna notice something. My hair is a lot shorter right now, and past Annie's hair is much longer. That's because Ontario's hairdressers have reopened again and I'm able to get my hair cut again. So she's nice and short now, so just a heads up on that. So let's take a look at what past me is doing over here. When planning, I knew for sure I'd be drafting the underlayer skirt, so I had to take my measurements to ensure my dress form was actually the right size, because if I'm going to be draping everything, it needs to be the right size waist, hip, bust. So I figured out the height of me as well as the general sizes and made sure my waist was kind of lining up with my dress form so the heights would look accurate while I was draping the skirt. So not only is this to keep it accurate to actually how tall and how wide I am, but also just in general gives me a better visual of how this whole skirt is going to look. And you can see me here just figuring out those measurements with and without the corset on and comparing it to the dress form. So for the petticoat, the first thing I need to do is start with the base layer. I have some planning notes in my sketchbook, which is so far mostly just Snow White notes, but kind of see the idea there. The idea is basically I need a bottom layer, and I'm going to be making ruffled tiers on top of each other that will sew onto that base layer. So what I'm draping right now is going to be that base layer. To come up with this idea and come up with how exactly I want to do this, I ended up talking with my friend Symphony Silk, who has a lot more experience with petticoats than me, to discuss what kind of petticoat this particular costume would require. And looking at the shape of the costume, we basically concluded that a Cinderella style one with the tiers getting bigger and bigger towards the bottom wouldn't cut it for this costume, which is how we came to the conclusion on the tiered petticoat. Before I can even get to the tiers, I need to figure out what those measurements are going to be, so I need to make that base layer that fits on top here. So a yoke at the top, it needs to have a middle layer, and it needs to have a bottom ruffle. I'm not using a pattern for this, as you see, I just have notes and measurements, and most of my measurements are going to come from what I'm about to do here, which is draping onto my undergarments to get the proper shaping for that yoke, and then from that yoke, I make the patterns that go all around here, and finally that ruffle that goes in the very bottom. So I guess it's time to start draping out my pieces for the yoke. Once I'm finished draping and finished marking everything onto the drape, it's really important to take the piece off and then trace it and clean it up nicely. So here you can see me using my French curves to kind of straighten out those lines and make them a little more uniform in a way, and making sure those curves work a little better and are a little cleaner, as well as adding seam allowance. Because if I just draped and didn't add seam allowance, this whole thing would be completely out of balance, and that would not be very good for the final product. After that, I had to make some more notes. I now had these pieces and I was able to work off of these yoke pieces to kind of determine the size and some future plans involving the other pieces that needed to be draped. And so I used these notes to then drape the next pieces on, which were going to be gathered onto the yoke. So I kind of took an estimate by doing some measurements and then decided to do this method for draping the next piece. Alright, so I didn't show the progress for this because it is just a mock-up, and I'm now going to recreate this in the final fabrics, but I did make a mock-up out of some sheeting of what the base layer of the petticoat is going to look like. The gathers aren't even, again, I did this really quickly just to make sure that there was enough volume at the bottom. Yes, there was. I just have to be better at gathering when I do the final thing. But I'm overall really happy with how this shape looks, and I just received bunch of stuff in the mail. This is all from Farthingales. This is some horsehair hem, which will be going on that bottom ruffle for this particular layer, just to really give it some volume and keep it out. Because if you look here, there's a lot of space between the floor and it, and we don't want it to kind of do this a lot. So the horsehair hem will just kind of keep it out a bit. And I'm using some broadcloths because they are really stiff and also quite cheap. And I also have some Tulle which I'm putting in the ruffle layers. But for now, I'm going to be focusing on making this layer here in the good fabrics. Now, don't mind quality control in the background, he's just doing his best. But this is my favorite method of cutting, and the only thing that wasn't cut this way was the actual yoke pieces. But I like to cut the real thing by just snipping and pulling, especially considering how long some of these pieces ended up being. As you can see, quality control is not very helpful with this process and needed to be right in there to make sure everything was going okay. It was a little bit of a nuisance, I'm not gonna lie. But basically, I just measure the lengths I need based on the measurements and the predictions I made over on my notes earlier, and just kind of measured and then clipped and pulled. And that was how I cut everything out for this besides the yoke. Every single seam in this particular part of the garment has a finish of some type, so if it's not a selvage edge, it was serged with either a regular serging stitch or a marrow hem, unless again there was a selvage edge, in that case I didn't bother. But in this case I am serging around the entire piece as well as these longer pieces, which were very awkward to do with my limited amount of space around my serger because I'm kind of crammed at the end of my sewing table. It was a little awkward. And then I started to seam things together, mostly straight lines at this point, and we're not getting to complicated ruffling yet, which is very nice because later on that's going to be quite a pain because it's going to be so tedious. And here's your first look at the horsehair hem. This stuff is amazing and so wibbly wobbly and wonderful, but it does also need some finishing. I wasn't going to serge this part, so I ended up bias finishing all the edges so that it wouldn't fray or get all prickly on the edges, because it could get some really prickly edges on it. So here I have all about 9.4 meters of it, so it's all looped into one big piece so I can actually put it together. And I have the horsehair stuff, horsehair crinoline, all attached here. All the ends are finished with bias, and this is one of the overlap areas because the pieces were only certain lengths when they came in this little bundle. But it's all pinned on here, and now that means it's just time to take that and start doing a lot of machine sewing. So I now have all of the horsehair hem attached, meters and meters of it. So now it's a matter of pressing everything so it's nice and flat and looks like a proper hem, and then stitching it all down again. So now I gotta bring it all over here, which means I'm just gonna bring this whole chair over there. So pressing this hem was simple enough, but also had to be very, very careful while doing it because this horsehair crin stuff could melt if the heat was too high or if the heat was directly put on it. So I had to be extra, extra careful. I also had, several meters worth of it to do. So it was actually a very long process, but the end result is so worth it because it ends up looking super, super clean and makes it much, much easier when it came to stitching the hem down. So much easier, you wouldn't even believe. And stitching the hem as well goes pretty straightforward as it is a straight seam here. That initial ironing did so much to help it be nice and clean and even, and the end product I'm really, really happy with. But the thing with horsehair crin is if you have to hem 2 areas, the bottom hem as well as the top of the horsehair piece, because otherwise it's gonna flop down or act really awkwardly. So this stitch here is what keeps it down in place and keeps it to actually control that hem and that flounce that we want at the bottom of the hem. Okay, so I now have this piece with the horsehair hem on there, and I have gone ahead and marked into quarters and eighth, because when it comes to gathering, it's a lot easier instead of doing one huge gathering around 9.4 meters of piece. So it's all going to be done in sections, all marked by a little pencil mark. I had to use pencil mark instead of using pins like I normally would, because I had to lay this down in my living room and my cat likes to pluck pins and play with them. So these are a lot better and safer for my little baby, and they are also erasable so later on, but they'll most likely be in the seam allowance anyway and won't be seen. So now I have to add it to the next layer, which is the layer that sits on most of the hoop skirt here. So basically what I need to do now is take those same points that I've marked on here, which I've also folded into eighths, have it marked with little pencil marks, and kind of line those up and then make sure I'm gathering and attaching it evenly to here. So right now the gathers are a little bit messily done over here. So now I gotta make them nice and even on here by pinning them all in place. But first I start off by pinning at all of these marked off points. And I pin them together at all the matching points and getting all those gathers into that space. That's what I'm doing now. So I'd like to thank Sam for holding this up for me. But I have the ruffle all put in there, pressed up. It's looking really nice. I'm loving how these are looking. And I have gone and marked the halfway points. So unlike this, which I had like 8 points, I'm only doing 4 on here because the piece I am putting it onto is pretty small. So the marks are essentially the seams and then the halfway points between those seams. Now the seams are not even because the back has a little bit more volume, but that's about it. But now what I did down here, I'm just gonna repeat up here onto the final yoke, which will make this whole underskirt completed. So we're getting there. That's quite a lot of progress done just today, but this is looking pretty cool so far, so pretty pleased. So my skirt is now at a place where it actually is a full finished base skirt and just needs all the different ruffled edges to go on it, which at this point I know will take an awful long time. The first step that I'm going to do is actually... Oh, hello, King. You look really angry. Goodness. But the first thing I need to do is make the bottom ruffle, because the bottom ruffle is going to be the exact same as this ruffle, essentially. So it's going to have the horsehair crinoline again. The only difference is that in between both layers, I'm going to be putting some tulle in there. But first I need to basically do the exact same thing I did before to make this bottom ruffle here, because it's the same exact size, with the same exact finish there, just to get that volume out so that it doesn't go under the skirt when I'm wearing it too much. But yeah, it's actually looking like a thing right now. And I now have a base that I can put all the ruffles on. So we're getting to the end of this project, kind of. I mean, I have a lot of ruffles and a lot of edges and a lot of hems to do now, but you know, we're getting there, and that's what's important. Right, King? My serger has just done a ton of work. It definitely deserves a break after this, and I couldn't really show you because I'm sort of crammed into a corner here, and it was really hard to get my equipment in here to actually film, but I do have the tulle layer cut and now all the edges serged. I need to cut that as well. Quality control is currently going over this giant piece, which I now need to gather in with this piece right here, which is the layer that goes on top, and these two will be put together and it'll be a nice poofed layer that will go on top here. This was a lot of finishing. This is finished and now has the horsehair crin in there, so it's nice and voluminous like this over here. It's essentially the same exact process, which is why I didn't show it too much. And this is a very similar process, just minus the horsehair crin at the bottom. It's just us serge finishings, so the long end on the top is going to have serging, where the seams are going to go has serging, and then the marrow hem serge at the bottom, which will be at the bottom of the hems, which will match the hems of the next few cotton layers once I get to them. The next part will be to gather these up, put them together essentially, and put them onto the skirt. I make the next few steps look so fast and easy, but some of them would actually take days at a time because again, I'm sometimes using about 9.4 meters of ruffle at once. And here you can see me pinning together the tulle/crinoline layers together to the cotton layer. And again, I make this look so nice and fast and easy, but it really took so much time to get it all evenly on there, as well as the stitching, because it's so much yardage at once. And it doesn't sound like a lot until you actually have it all on your sewing table and you suddenly realize it's just a lot of stitching. I went through a lot of thread during this process, and I'm just happy that most of my ruffles were in a rectangular shape because I feel like I would have gone crazy if they were circular. And the ruffling also was a little more difficult this time compared to the other ruffle because this time we have that tulle/crinoline layer in there, which just likes to be flouncy and tough and rough. So my legs were absolutely wrecked after this because I was wearing shorts and this stuff is really prickly even with the finished edge. Do wear long pants or jeans while doing this, folks, because it will save your legs from getting all scratched up. And also, this took so much patience because getting it under my machine was so incredibly difficult sometimes because there was just so much ruffle volume trying to get under there and trying not to catch everything to keep everything nice and even. Honestly, it felt more intense than the footage is making it look. I can vouch for that. Alright, the ruffle is now in place. So here it is. After all that sewing with the tulle underneath and the original ruffle underneath as well. And then it's a matter of making more and more ruffles, this time without the horsehair hem at least, but time to make a ton more ruffles for this. Oh boy. So with that, the petticoat is completely finished, and we have the garment that you see right here next to me, and I'm wearing in a few clips here. In total, this took about 2.5 months of on and off work during my free time or after work occasionally. A lot of that time was spent ruffling and hemming, and in total that's about 40 hours worth of work. And that is more work than the corset in hours. The total amount of purchased cotton poly fabric was about 15 meters, which was then cut up into the ruffle pieces. So that 15 meters made up all the different yardage that I used on the ruffle. When cut up, that turned into about 44.46 meters worth of ruffles, which I needed to hem. And there's also about 35.5 meters of tulle and in there as well, which also all needed to be serged and hemmed. And finally, there's about 18 meters of this nice flat crin or horsehair hem in the bottom layers to keep it from getting pushed under the hoop skirt too much. So all in all, that's the final statistics of this garment. It was both a joy to make, satisfying to make, but also a darn pain because it's very tedious and some parts took a very long time to do, and my cat would not cooperate very much. But it's done, and this means that next I can start working on the actual recognizable pieces of the Snow White cosplay. If you'd like to see those, be sure to stick around, and if you'd like to see the progress on how I made the hoop skirt, the chemise and drawers, and the corset that you see up there, check out my channel because those are all posted as well. And as for when the next parts are going to come out, I can't tell you because they're not started yet. Stick around and eventually you'll get to see how I make the rest of the costume. And if you like this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And I'll see you guys in the next one. See you guys later.